Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another OpenChain partner webinar. The format of the partner webinars is consistent. We have a short introduction like this, then we play a recorded message from our partner explaining their products and/or services around the OpenChain ecosystem, and after that we have some space for live questions. Of course, because talking with partners about complex things like products and services can lead to a lot of questions, you can continue your discussion or start it through our mailing lists or directly with the partners or with me. Today, we're going to have a presentation from PwC, one of the major partners for the OpenChain project, a third-party certifier for us, and an organization that has helped us a great deal in Germany and beyond. This information provided in the webinar is designed to educate you. Many of our viewers are going to be from companies using open source in the supply chain. A lot of these companies will do many of their management things on their own, but a lot of these companies will also have questions about the type of support available. That's why we're here, and that's why we're going to find out more. Before I show the presentation from PwC, I'm just putting up our antitrust policy notice here. Because we have an open discussion space at the end of the presentation, it's important to ensure that we show our policy for antitrust, which we do for every meeting with open discussion. The idea is just to explain the parameters for comfortable conversation. If you have any questions about this, you can ask our counsel, Andy Updegrove. Okay, with that formality out of the way, let's move into the fun part. So Marcel and his team at PwC have done a lot of work around OpenChain, and indeed just hosted our most recent OpenChain Germany work group in Cologne, which was absolutely lovely. In this video, you'll find out more about what they do in this domain. We're part of many services they provide around open source and other open technologies. And hopefully it will inspire you to fill in points where you think, well, how could I get help around this? Now, I would be remiss not to mention that there are other partner webinars, and of course, there are partners all around the world for the OpenChain project. So this is one example of one partner explaining their services. You can watch our other webinars to find out about our other partners. Let's move straight into that video.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, whenever and wherever from you are watching this live or the recording. We are delighted to have you with us. Welcome to our PwC webinar at OpenChain. Open source software management as per OpenChain or ISO 5230 is state of the art. You should ask yourself and challenge your organization. Are you up to speed? Are you ready? But first, let me introduce our speakers today. In our session today, we have Katharina, who's a very experienced open source software expert and also has a background in software asset management and loves all topics around OSS compliance and the process management around it. And we have Lucas, who also has a deep experience in open source software management, a very technical background, and loves to deep dive into open source toolchain and its management. My name is Marcel, and I'm a computer scientist, and I'm the lead of our open source software services. PwC is a global network of member firms. Our community of solvers has over 300,000 people and operates in over 150 countries. And in the areas of consulting, audit, and tax and legal, every day we bring in our passion to serve our purpose, to build trust in society and solve important problems. And actually, this is our mission in the field of open source software as well. And we are very well aligned with OpenChain. We build trust in open source software and we solve important problems. PwC is a strategic partner for open source software management. And our open source software competencies are derived from an interdisciplinary team of software developers, lawyers, compliance experts, and business consultants. We have a fully integrated open source software portfolio, which covers all areas around open source software, from consulting, auditing and certifications, managed services for very operational tasks, and legal advice. Also, we are engaged in the open source community. We have a JBR with OpenChain. We support drafting of standards and the ISO 5030. And also, we are committed to national OSS communities and surveys. Before I hand over to my colleagues, let us have a look at our latest quarterly market update and insights from PwC on open source software. I won't go through all the details here, but let me just pick out some interesting parts. So when we look at the market, what we've seen, particular end of last calendar year and beginning of this calendar year, we had the large issue around Log4Shell. And actually, it's still an issue and a challenge for some clients today. And just recently, the Python tar file exploit came up again, and it's still an issue for thousands of packages which are in software development, in products, and maybe also in your company. So generally, in the last year, we've seen a very high increase of open source risks and supply chain attacks with 10,000 of malicious packages. So this is something we need to take care of. But besides these negative aspects or these challenges, we also see very positive engagement of the community. So companies who encourage upstream and contribution, and also companies who invest into open source communities and have policies to do so. When we look at the challenges, it's interesting, but after all these years of open source compliance management, still compliance has to be managed and is top of the notch of the issues that companies need to take care of. Particularly based on the risks I mentioned before, transparent supply chains are now state of the art and need to be implemented so that it's clear that there are no risks coming in from external software through the supply chain. Risk mitigation in terms of taking care of open source software security for your internal development and external acquired software is another topic that companies nowadays invest their time in and need to manage correctly. And besides these topics of security and compliance, the visibility of companies who are engaged in open source software development and their reputation is very important to foster global collaboration, to increase employer retention and improve employer branding. And I mean, again, open source is out there for many, many years and decades, but only over the last years and recently, we see that these positive effects are more and more taken care of in companies. There are many solutions that can be applied to manage these challenges, from a open source software strategy to establishing an open source framework, code transparency. But let me hand over to my colleagues, Katharina and Lucas, to tell you more about it.
So as Marcel already pointed out, there's a lot going on in the open source area. We have various trends and risks which have to be managed. But how to do that? So what we have done in this picture is a categorization of drivers, meaning external drivers, strategic and operational drivers. So at the bottom, you can see external drivers and stakeholders. For instance, as Marcel mentioned, the ISO 5230 standard, formats as SPDX or trends of innovation have a major impact on how we use and manage open source within an organization. But there are also external stakeholders as suppliers, clients, communities, or also potential new employees have an impact on how we are dealing with open source. So based on those external drivers, we can derive the strategic and operational drivers. So the former means aspects which have a direct impact on how we strategically deal with open source, meaning points as digital transformation, the overall IT strategy within a company, sustainability factors, reputation, and so on. And the operational drivers show how we deal with open source in our daily business. For instance, security threats, compliance uncertainty, or operational requirements have a direct impact on how we manage open source. So how to build a framework around all those topics. So basically, in the beginning, we need to define our overall targets. So the targets we have in the middle here show that the target of efficiency can only be reached if we have transparency in the first instance, and afterwards compliance and security. In order to build the framework, we have to involve with different stakeholders within the organization. So here we have our second layer. In this layer, we see different areas or departments within an organization, but directly engage with open source software. So for example, we have the IT sourcing team, we have a legal team, we have IT and security, we have, of course, IT development, and for instance, software asset management. So all those areas are engaged with open source and need to be directly involved when building an open source framework. In the last layer, we finally have our elements of the governance framework. So as I already said, we have to start with the overall objectives and targets. Then we have to build policies and guidelines in order to ensure that open source is handled within a defined framework. We have to build roles and responsibilities to ensure that all people who are working with open source know what their responsibilities are. Then we have processes and tooling, which have to be designed in a very efficient manner to ensure that the efforts are distributed in a logical way. And lastly, we need training and communication because the whole organization has to be aware on, of course, the positive aspects of open source, but also on the risks when using this technology. So we now move from theory to practice. And my colleague Lucas and I will present some of our recent project experience to show you how our daily business looks like. So one of my last projects was with a large manufacturing client. The client was already very mature and experienced in open source management. However, there was still room for some improvement. So what was the problem? The client already had a very complex tooling and process structure. However, some processes were not running efficiently and took quite a long time. Moreover, the workload in the OSPO was quite high, as there were high communication efforts within the projects, within the business departments, which were requesting approval of the open source usage. So what was our proposed solution? First, we did a maturity assessment and evaluated the current state at the client. And then, based on that, we derived concrete measures, what needs to be done to improve the situation. So we did a gap analysis. Afterwards, we supported the client in the process improvement. One major problem with the client was a lack of open source knowledge within the business. So the open source requests from the projects were not raised correctly. There were missing information, or the information was provided in the wrong format. So we supported awareness and training measures. And moreover, we improved the processes by defining clear roles and responsibilities for each process step. And also did the documentation of those roles and responsibilities. By that, we were able to implement a connection between project and the business and the OSPO. In the end, this was a great experience for me because we enabled compliant and efficient use of open source at the client. And moreover, we and the client we're able to effectively measure our success based on the shortened process time. So what about your experience, Lucas?
Thanks for handing over. I would like to cover a project on a readiness assessment for ISO 52030. For those who are not aware of it, just a brief overview. A readiness assessment for ISO 52030 is an assessment against the full ISO standard, but demands on a smaller scale and on a reduced scope to gain a certifier's professional feedback early on in your company's ISO 52030 journey. We usually conduct it as an optional add-on for a full third-party certification, but we can also provide the service to be done isolated from a certification if desired. In general, we conduct spot checks on process descriptions and guideline reviews to gain the design effectiveness, and with a few test of ones and walkthroughs, we get a quick insight in your operating effectiveness as well. Finally, handing over a draft of recommendations for the client's own self-responsible remediation. The example project I brought with me today was a client who was in the broader move towards restructuring of their open source compliance processes and already piloting several new structures and governance models with new policy and processes in several parts. The client wanted to ensure their risk mitigation efforts within their processes by validating against the ISO 52030 as state-of-the-art for quality open source software management. Our focus in this case was the identification of process gaps and clarification of those gaps, because our client restructured several things for his pilot and wanted to make sure that every necessary part is covered by the new processes. So if a client has a certain area of interest, we are also able to target a certain topic already during a readiness assessment. So without going into too much detail of what we did at the client, we found some deficits in the process handling of feedback loops in the content review and approval for bill of materials and the compliance artifact creation regarding some of the tasks that the ISO 52030 demands, namely the identifying, tracking, reviewing, approving, and archiving of those compliance artifacts and the bill of materials. And also the client and his policy development was lacking a clear written down policy on contributions towards existing open source projects. So we mentioned that a fully written down policy is necessary for the software developers to be able to contribute to projects in a guided way. To bring it all together, a brief overview of our services to enable your digital future and reduce risks. Our services are structured in three major areas, namely consulting and implementation work, audit and certifications, and managed services. With our consulting and implementation, we have a benchmarking and optimization service capturing your on-site maturity in all OSS compliance processes and develop actions to optimize those, as Katharina reported earlier in her project example. With our security optimization, we design and implement policies and safeguards for your open source security management to address a proper handling, for example, of CVEs and their remediation. With our strategy and enablement, we analyze company-specific OSS opportunities and develop strategies with you to realize the whole potential of open source. Our program implementation is basically a whole setup of a full open source compliance management framework, including the definition of necessary policies, processes, tooling implementation, assistance with piloting your first project. So really a full setup. With our audit services and certifications, we've focused around ISO 52030 with the readiness assessment and the third-party certification like I described earlier, but also provide services in M&A due diligence processes with open source compliance assessments to clearly know any risks in your merger or your deal, for example, with code scanning and SBOM creation with a final report for your due diligence. We can also audit your suppliers, so you can fully rely on a quality open source software management at your B2B relationships to trust in, for example, open source artifacts like SBOMs that the supplier provides you. With our managed services, we take on your operative tasks and support in several critical aspects of open source compliance processes, like code scanning and SBOM creation, but we can also verify your supplier's SBOMs as a third party. For example, if a supplier doesn't want to expose the source code to you, PwC as an independent third party can verify an SBOM with the source code. For ongoing practices like trainings and your open source processes and compliances, we create and conduct target-specific trainings, for example, starting from new hires with full basics on open source and how to engage with open source, use it in your company environment, up to experienced senior staff and technical trainings on your scanning and SBOM creation tool chains, for example. Similar to our audit and of suppliers, we offer managed services to do a similar thing, auditing your new suppliers in an ongoing operation, or for example, in large potential suppliers in tendering processes, we can also assess open source compliance management maturity for your business relations to build trust in open source supply chains. Lastly, PwC can also be your single point of contact for open source questions regarding compliance management with our OSPO as a service to support a whole product lifecycle or service lifecycle to stay compliant throughout. We hope you are now well aware of the current challenges of open source and how PwC is there to build trust in open source and solving your important problems. If there are any questions left, we are here to answer live. Otherwise, the PwC open source team is happy to offer you one-on-one conversations to address your questions and accompany you on your individual open source software journey, leveraging all benefits in a secure and compliant manner. Thank you for your attention.
All right, everyone. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation. Now, as I said, this presentation will be available on the OpenChain website as a recording, so you'll have all of that information to review later. But there is an opportunity right now to talk with our friends and colleagues in PwC. We have quite a few of the parties on the line, including Marcel, who's leading the team. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to ask them. I'm just going to give you the ability to unmute yourselves now. So that is on the table. I'm going to start the discussion with a question. Now, this is something I haven't pre-planned and preceded with Marcel and his team, so this is out of the blue. This is me just asking a question. Please be aware of that. Marcel, I was just curious, PwC obviously has a lot of services around open source. You're a certifier on ISO 5230, the international standard for open source license compliance. I was wondering if the new OpenChain security assurance specification is on your radar for certification services and support of adoption as well.
Yeah, hi Shane, hi everyone. Thanks for this question. And yes, of course, I mean, as you know, we are already involved in the standard and translations, etc. And of course, we look into the development, and we are also planning on providing services around the security specification and also readiness assessment and certification against it as soon as it's available.
Fantastic. And when it comes to companies looking for help around the de facto standard, I'm guessing that they can probably approach you now. And then when it comes to your third-party certification portfolio, your third-party certification services would mostly go online when it's an ISO standard. Is that correct?
Sorry, can we repeat the last part of the question?
Yeah.
It didn't come correctly.
My apologies. Let me try and be clearer. So I understand then that you can help people with the security assurance specification as is today. So for instance, you've already begun translating it and providing it to the community at large in German, which is amazing. When it comes to your third-party certification services, are they available for the de facto standard, or will you wait on the third-party certification front for the ISO standard?
That's a good question. So for the de facto standard, we will provide an audit report on the effectiveness and operational effectiveness and design effectiveness in a company. But the actual certification where we provide a certificate will probably only be available for the official ISO. Because for our official certification process, where we certify an organization as per ISO 17021, the official ISO process for certification of ISOs. Yeah, for this we need an ISO.
That makes a lot of sense.
I don't know if this was clear.
No, it is, absolutely. So, I mean, it's very clear. The de facto standard, you can definitely help people with readiness assessment and so on, but your certification process is an ISO certification process. So I think that's super clear and super useful to know. We have another question. So Can asked, how would one go about learning open source security compliance management? Are there information or courses that can teach this step by step? This is sort of off topic. So Marcel, feel free to answer the question as well. I'm just going to jump in with a note from the OpenChain perspective on this. Yeah. For open source security compliance management, just like all software security compliance management, there are resources around the place. For instance, you can get some free resources from organizations like the Linux Foundation, and I understand that projects like Open Source Security Foundation will be making more resources available. So I would start by looking at Linux Foundation training and looking at projects like Open Source Security Foundation for the kind of what's available freely here from the community. But I'm going to throw over to Marcel here, because I imagine PwC has quite a lot of security compliance management training and courses, etc., or at least support.
Yeah, I mean, Shane, in terms of what is out there freely available, I think you've covered it very well, particularly in terms of open source security. I mean, I would also look into the community reference material, which is available from the OpenChain project and output from the OpenChain education work group. But of course, I mean, as PwC, we also provide trainings and information and readiness assessment and support in this area, but on a project basis, of course.
Wonderful. Yeah, and a very good point, Marcel, about the types of resources available. So when it comes to those on the call or those listening to the call, just remember that you can turn up anywhere, like this call or any of the OpenChain mailing lists, and you can access all of the material we have, and we'll guide you to all of the material that other people have based on your questions. And of course, Marcel and I were just talking about the security assurance reference specification. So OpenChain does have a de facto industry standard for open source security management. So it's security compliance management, exactly what you're looking for. What I'll do, and this is a pause in between questions. If people have other questions, now is your moment to share them. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to put in the chat a link to the security assurance specifications so that people can go and look at that if they're brand new to what we're doing. Okay, so there's a checklist for this specification that people can use. Now that's describing the security approach for open source. So let's talk about how you do a security program. It isn't training material around it, but we're building out lots and lots of material there. And as I said, you know, LF training has courses which are free. Open Source Security Foundation is producing material which is free. So that's really good places to start. And join our monthly calls. Okay, throwing open the floor. Does anyone have an additional question for Marcel and his team? If there's no other immediate question, I have one to end, which relates to actually the industry of usage. So in Germany, I'm aware that automotive is pretty big around open source, but also having formal processes around it and working with organizations like PwC around management solutions. I was just curious, Marcel, in a jurisdiction like Germany, have you seen other industries like energy, banking, defense, and so on being as active as automotive or not? Naturally, I don't ask for customer specifics. I'm just curious, industry by industry, if there's a lot of similar interest or if some industries are more prevalent than others.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you mentioned the one which is most prevalent, so automotive, but in the last years, the other industries also picked up.
Hang on, I just exited another webinar.
Someone was unmuted. Let's go through that again. You were saying that automotive is the biggest one, but there's other industries as well.
Other industries are picking up, and so I think automotive was the first one who was very active, and now the other ones are just starting. So and even so in public sector, more and more traction comes to this topic to manage open source correctly, not only in Germany but also in other countries where we see it. And then also of course we have manufacturers in general, and then the tech companies who take care of this. So yeah, from our perspective, more and more industries are speeding up with managing open source software compliance.
Fantastic. And, you know, for those of you who are new to the call and the German work group, be aware that Marcel and I will be doing meetings in Germany next year, where you can also meet his team face to face, and we can hopefully talk through how the market is developing. Marcel, and of course, everyone else involved in the production, thank you so much for the recording. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you face to face and also doing our future work together around things like translations, reference material, and so on in the community domain.
Thank you. Speak to you soon.
Take care. Everyone, be well. Thank you for coming to the webinar. And please, of course, share the recording with your friends. It'll be out within 24 hours. Have a beautiful day. Stay safe, stay healthy, and talk soon.